Well, welcome, folks, to this edition of the 700 Club. Well, it seems to be a never-ending story. The terror group known as Hamas talks peace to the whole world while it continues to wage war on Israel. More than 150 rockets soared across the border just on Wednesday, sending Israelis to the hospital and thousands more into bomb shelters.
Israel is striking back, taking out more than 100 Hamas strongholds in Gaza. As John Waggy explains, this all comes after weeks of negotiations for a long-term ceasefire.
In the streets of Sderot, panic once again as the sirens signal incoming rockets from Gaza. Hamas says the barrage is retaliation for Israel's earlier killing of 2 Hamas snipers who were said to be in training and not firing at Israeli troops. The terror group's response sent stressed-out Israelis heading for shelters, and Israel's military pounded Hamas targets in the Gaza Strip with strike after strike. This wave of bombardment comes after days of debate here in Jerusalem about whether Israel should agree to a 5-year Egyptian-brokered ceasefire with Hamas. Now, with roads and beaches and summer camps closing in southern Israel and weary residents sick of sirens, the talk has turned to military strategy. At least one Knesset member, a retired colonel, is calling for the heads of the Hamas leadership. And U.S. Middle East negotiator Jason Greenblatt tweeted, "Another night of terror and families huddling in fear as Israel defends itself. This is the Hamas regime's choice. Hamas is subjecting its people to the terrifying conditions of war again." Meanwhile, UN leaders warn that Gaza residents face impending disaster, with severe fuel shortages already plaguing the city. But with more than 100,000 Israelis under fire, the fuel problem may not be Gaza's greatest worry in the days ahead. John Waggy, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, it was amazing when the Israelis who had control of the Gaza Strip pulled out of it in supposedly a peace effort. It was ill-considered, and it looks like every time they make an overture of peace, Hamas, or one of those radical groups, comes in to steal the peace away. Well, that's what's happening, and they control that part of the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority really has no control over Gaza. It's a shame. It really is a shame, but that's what's going on. Well, in other news, we've told you how cyber attacks could leave millions scrambling in the dark. Energy Secretary Rick Perry tells CBN News his #1 priority is protecting the power grid. Ephraim Graham has more from our CBN newsroom. Here's Ephraim.
Well, Pat, from banking to transportation to communications, major industries are connected by the internet. That technology can pose a grave threat to our national security. In an exclusive interview with the Energy Secretary, he tells CBN's Jenna Browder some of the best minds in America are working to protect America against cyber attacks.
There's perhaps no more serious threat to the United States than a crippling cyber attack on the country's power grid. Just ask Secretary of Energy Rick Perry. It's what he says he and his department are largely focused on. How vulnerable is the United States power grid from a major cyber attack?
It's of great concern because we're not where we were 10 years ago. This is a completely different world we live in from the standpoint of how it's interconnected.
Perry says one factor is old infrastructure, and it's not actually all bad.
So in one way, that kind of protects it because you got some old technology in there, some old analog equipment. On the other hand, all the digital, the new types of technology that's there is vulnerable to a cyber attack.
Another factor.
The Russians have some thuggish behavior. There's not any doubt about that.
Russia and other countries like Iran, North Korea, and China looking to infiltrate everything from our power plants to elections. In the case of Russia.
So I think we're finding the right balance between if you cannot be a citizen of the world and act in an appropriate way, there's going to be some real punishments. But if you do, then we can find some ways to work together, to trade together, to to help each other.
When it comes to North Korea, how much of a role is the Department of Energy playing in talks with Kim Jong-un and in denuclearization? I
think the president is spot on. I think he's very courageous to step forward and carry on these conversations and carry on this dialogue.
And if the administration can achieve that goal, Perry says the Department of Energy will play a key role because of its technical expertise.
If the president and Secretary Pompeo and others are successful in getting North Korea to agree to denuclearize, the Department of Energy will play a substantial role in the verification side of it, of the deconstructing of any of the weapons, and then the decommissioning and disposal of as well.
If there's a silver lining to the threat our power grid faces, Secretary Perry says it's this.
We're vulnerable, but every place in the world is vulnerable. The good news is that our national labs, some of the smartest men and women in the world, are working on ways to defend, working on ways to both defensively and offensively deal with these individuals who would attack our grid.
In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
And Pat, you've warned of this danger for quite some time.
A whole lot about it. You know, I appreciate what Secretary Perry was saying, but I sure wish he would said, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, what we're going to do, not we've got good minds studying it. We've studied it long enough. The threat is absolutely real. And you've got, again, a thermonuclear blast at about 1,500, 2,000 feet in the heartland of America would cripple the grid all across this nation. That's number one. A solar flare, and they're not unheard of. Suddenly you've got a blast from the sun of solar energy that comes out, and that could knock our grid out. And when that happens, I'm talking about its tragedy, and millions of people will die. I don't want to have people studying it anymore. I want them to fix it. And I think the thing we need to do is a major, major governmental thrust to make sure that this grid is safe and hardened. And we've got to get all those nodes taken care of. And if some of them are cyber and some, the old-fashioned, well, that's not interesting, and some of them are new and on the internet, well, that's good too, but we've got to fix them so they all work together. It is a crisis that's got to be dealt with, and the money involved is minuscule compared to the damage that can be done with one of these cyber attacks. Well, Ephraim, what you got?
Pat, President Trump's attorneys are saying no to an interview with Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Mueller wanted an in-person interview covering several topics, including possible obstruction of justice. The president's team will not accept those terms, saying they'll take written questions but probably won't answer any about obstruction of justice. Now Mueller can make a counteroffer or try to force the president to testify. The president's attorney says that would be unprecedented.
So long as he's making the decision voluntarily and not submitting to a subpoena, then that's not inconsistent with what other presidents did. There's no question the president would resist any kind of an attempt to force him to testify.
Rudy Giuliani also repeated his calls for Mueller to wrap this Russia investigation, saying there should be a report by September 1st. Pat?
Well, Rudy's also said that the scandal is going to be the special prosecutor and his team, and the fact that they didn't go after Hillary Clinton. There's one fact that we've learned just recently is that the FBI notified Senator Feinstein that she had a Chinese agent working in her staff, and she immediately dismissed this individual. They should have done the same thing for President Trump, but they didn't. Yet they have brought charges against some of these people, but they've said they didn't notify the candidate that he had suspicious people working with him. And if there wasn't anything, it looks like the only charge they've got is this Christopher Steele dossier that was paid for by the Democrats. And the whole thing has been a fraud from the beginning. And it's said that the American people are going to be absolutely horrified when all this comes out. But in the meantime, Mueller keeps dragging. And, I had Alan Dershowitz on the other day, and we were talking about the Whitey Bulger matter. when when the so-called special prosecutor was then running the FBI office in Boston, and Bolger was hiding out in plain sight, and the FBI couldn't catch him. It was just ridiculous. So these people are not the sharp watchdogs of our safety that they purport to be. And the FBI has had a terrible stain on its reputation because of the misconduct of people like Peter Strzok and Lisa Page and others like that. It's just horrible to see it happening. But the fact that he might try to, I don't know if they want to go to war with the president on this one to force him to testify, because he, what is obstruction of justice? The leading legal experts say that a president, in fulfillment of his constitutional mandated responsibilities, cannot be held guilty of, quote, obstructing justice. You just cannot obstruct justice when you're following out your constitutional duties. So in any event, I hope this thing, it's weighing on all of us. It needs to be wrapped up. We've had enough of it. It's cost a lot of money, and it's not doing anybody any good at all. It really isn't. They aren't. Alan Dershowitz said so clearly some years ago, and he said it again, we should have had a commission study this matter. If there is Russian influence, then it ought to be dealt with on a dispassionate level by a blue ribbon commission, not by some prosecutor. All right, Ephraim, what's next?
Pat, despite high-level negotiations between Turkish and U.S. officials in Washington Wednesday, American pastor Andrew Brunson remains under house arrest in Turkey. He faces another hearing on espionage-related charges in October. Many call the proceedings a kangaroo court, and until now, Brunson's supporters have had no idea what's happening. CBN's Jennifer Wishon brings us this first-hand account from inside the courtroom.
A courtroom designed to make Pastor Brunson feel defeated, bogus witnesses bribed by the prosecution, and the power of forgiveness. An eyewitness takes us inside Pastor Brunson's persecution in Turkey.
The court used to be like a basketball court or some sort of sports court that has been turned into a courtroom right next to a very large prison. And way up front, there are 3 judges on a raised dais, and very low is Pastor Andrew Brunson, witnesses for the prosecution, and Pastor Brunson's lawyer. There are over 500 chairs between him and the area where observers like me and his wife are allowed to seat.
Christina Arriaga of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Liberty attended Pastor Brunson's most recent hearing. Seated beside his wife, Noreen, she watched in disbelief.
Because Pastor Brunson cannot see very well from far away, anytime he looks back towards his wife, she stands up and puts her hand over her heart so he knows he's not alone. Pastor Brunson sat there while he heard former church members, people probably that he baptized, people that he had tea with, testify against him. And the judge at one point turned to him around noontime and asked Andrew Brunson to speak for himself. And he said, "My faith teaches me to forgive, so I forgive those who just testified against me." There was a chill in the room. I know his wife, who was graceful and extremely strong, probably found it to be a natural answer, but I was stunned and moved to tears when he said that.
Why would his church members, people that he was intimate with, testify against him?
I imagine these people were under tremendous pressure to keep their jobs or feed their families. We don't know what kind of threats they were under.
Brunson has been transferred from prison to house arrest, but Arriaga fears that puts him at risk.
But he's in a terribly dangerous situation because the Brunsons are portrayed in the Turkish press as people who are against the state of Turkey, and I have great fears there's going to be an increase of incitement to violence against him, and no one will be able to stop a mob that tries to go and kill him.
Armed with sanctions and the power to withhold F-35 fighter jets Turkey wants to purchase, U.S. officials from the White House to Congress continue to pressure Turkey's President Recep Erdogan to release Brunson. His next hearing is October 12th. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News.
An amazing account. Pat.
Well, The Turks were our strong allies. They're members of NATO, but Erdogan is clearly trying to move Turkey into a Islamic dictatorship, a theocracy. And this thing, he talked about the clash between the mosque and the church and so forth. He really wants to fight with Christians. Brunson had a little church, I think in North Carolina, a little evangelical church like Baptist or something like that. He had a small little church in, it was at Izmir, Turkey. And he wasn't doing anything to hurt anybody. And to claim that he's somehow an enemy of the state is just outrageous. But in Turkey, they supposedly had religious freedom. And we've had a lot of people in Turkey. We have a very robust program in Turkey. And thousands of those people have come to the Lord. They're good people. But this Erdogan is not one of the people we want to support. And we put sanctions already. President Trump has sanctioned a couple of his officials, and it looks like more is coming. Withholding, we certainly shouldn't have them doing F-35 high-powered jets to build up their military because they want to use them against Israel. But again, read the book of Ezekiel chapter 38, and you'll find somebody in there called Gomer. Well, what is Gomer? Well, that is Turkey. And if you read Revelation, the churches of Revelation, all the way through Thyatira and Laodicea and all those churches in Revelation, they're all in Turkey, every single one of them. Turkey's, they call it the churches of Asia, but Asia Minor was Turkey. And it's very prominent in the Bible. And from what I read, it's going to be part of a coalition against Israel. So it's time for us to come to put the screws to Turkey's right now. But they have a major air base, the Incirlik air base in Turkey, and it's a very important transit point for our troops when we're doing activities in the Middle East. And Turkey can withhold permission for us, our planes, to take off and land. It's a bad situation that we're in with Turkey. And we need to deal with Erdogan because he is a bad actor.